All right, let's get started. Welcome to the October 19th Capital Finance Community Task Force. My name is Cynthia Krass, and along with Vice Chair Jamie Finch, the chair of this task force, thanks for all being here and for contributing all of your time and energy and expertise to this important work. As was just mentioned, Councilmember Martz will not be in attendance tonight, and we definitely have a quorum. Last meeting, we discussed public finance tools, and the task force asked a lot of great and meaty questions, and I'll just remind you that they will be addressed in a subsequent meeting. They will definitely not be forgotten, and we'll get to those in the next meeting or two or so. But tonight will be, if I'm not mistaken, the first installment of the discussion around priorities and criteria for capital and infrastructure projects generally. We do have a lot to cover tonight. As you know, Andrea does a lot of heavy lifting, providing content and running the meeting. To make it a little easier on her, I'll be monitoring the chat this evening, and I'll be calling on you so that she can free up her energy to focus on the content. As a reminder, when you do have a question or comment, please use the chat. Put the word question or comment in the chat and wait for me to call on you. And please don't put anything substantive or material in the chat. It doesn't go on the record and it gets distracting, so we'll keep just using that for question and comment. If we start to run short on time, I might make exceptions to the order in case there's some people we haven't heard from. If I see their names pop up, I might go out of order. And that's all I have for now. Moving on, I believe, to minutes. Let's see, just taking a peek, make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Yes, so I am seeking approval of minutes by unanimous consent as presented. I am not seeing or hearing any objections, so the minutes are approved as presented. Andrea, do we have any public comment tonight?
Thank you, Cynthia. I would look to Tina as to whether we have public comment tonight. Tina?
Hi, we do have one guest in our attendee area. Let me move over there and see if they'd like to make comment. Hi, welcome. Would you like to make comment this evening?
Yeah, I raised my hand. I guess maybe that wasn't sufficient.
No, thank you. You have the floor.
Okay, do I get no video? Okay.
No, that's fine. Give me just a moment.
There.
I'm bringing you forward now, and if you'd like to turn on your video, you may.
There we go.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. I always think it's a little bit better when you can actually see me too. So my name is Connie Marsh. For those of you who don't know me, I live on Squawk, and so I've been actively hurting the city for about 23 years. So that's the number of budget sessions I've been through, and that is the number of capital discussions that I have heard. So I was listening to last meeting, and I gotta say I was snickering because the concept of prioritization at a given moment of time has been an issue forever, because, pardon me, council members that are here, the council and the city seems to like to put their capital money in the shiny object of the moment, which I tend to call whack-a-mole. And so we hit the whack-a-mole and then we move on. And what this does is this leaves us partway through certain projects and sort of with spotty capital expenditures and not much in the pot, which then means you turn to the community and you say, hey, we need money for this or that. And you try to make it the things that the community wants so that you can get the money to pay for the capital expenditures. And so I guess this is supposed to help that particular problem, though I did not hear it enunciated that way. That would be a hope and dream for me. Now, how a community group setting a system of priorities at a given moment in time can move forward into the future successfully, I think is your hardest thing, whatever those priorities are. You don't want to do all this work and then just have it fall off because the next council or administration doesn't like the tool. So I don't know how to do that, but I think you need to try to figure that out if you don't want this just to be a lovely learning exercise for you. So we have a few issues in the city, and that is the city is to some extent disconnected with the community, and so it's surprised often when things happen, like we have an entire mobility master plan that discusses multimodal and all of that, and then the number one priority on the community survey is basically traffic congestion, which wasn't addressed at all in the mobility master plan. So this means that there is this linkage that needs to be solved, because any of your capital priorities need to actually be something that the community agrees with. It can't just be the small think tank that's in the city and those engaged communities who are going there, because that's not going to get you where you want to go. So that is spot number 2 that needs to be fixed in order to be successful. And then number 3 is the broken point of we are trying to fix things that tend to be of regional use with city dollars. And you can talk about transportation, you can talk about our awesome park system which got insane regional use in COVID. And then you can look at the regional dollars that are available and say, wow, how do we understand where the sweet spot is, where the citizens of Issaquah are paying their share, but the region is paying their share? And so I don't think you can discount the impact of the region on all of our infrastructure and infrastructure maintenance. So then here's the next one. We have our infrastructure, and our infrastructure by definition erodes. It's you basically would look at it as a depreciating out our infrastructure. And so we need a constant reinvestment in all of our capital usage in order not to lose ground. So you all are looking at capital priorities seemingly to enhance the system. But I think equally important is figuring out a funding mechanism not to erode the system, so that then you could have standing capital pots, right, for replacement, which we have that for like a few little teeny tiny things. So the capital expenditures do not solve problems. So I would caution you not to be the surgeon who thinks that surgery is the answer. Often programs and education might do as much or more to solve some of our problems. So the problem identification, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And the question of, is a capital influx actually the correct mechanism for solving that problem, needs to be part of your thought process for all of this. Now, I hope this helps you wrap your arms around this very complex topic. It is just one of the ways that I think of it, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Ms.
Connie.
Marsh. I do have another attendee, David Kapler. I will be promoting you here, and then you can unmute and come on camera if you'd like.
I'm working on my video. Oh, I am there. You just need to see more than my gray mass on top. All right. The city is a regional provider for parks, open space, and trails. And we're also, which I think is more obvious to people, fortunately, we have great partners with King County and 2 state parks. I mean, we're a city adjoining two state parks. Actually, one's completely in the city, one is adjoining the city, the Squaw Mountain. But because of these mountains and that lake problem we have to the north, we get all the traffic that wants to get to the regional system, I-90. And that's only going to get more of an issue if we get, when we get, let's hope, mass transit to rail transit, light rail to the city. Recognizing that, I'm told the final numbers on the Bergsma acquisition actually were a whole bunch of regional money came into it, which is our tax money as well. But pure Issaquah tax money was turned out to be a fairly small number when you think of it's fully in the city of Issaquah and a great benefit to the city. Transportation, I know often we base our transportation projects more on what are the regional grants, federal grants, state grants, King County. Where's the money that we can pull things off? Not necessarily the best transportation solution, but the one that we can afford because we can get into a lot of other governments' pockets. Overall satisfaction, I think, with a lot of us is quite good with the city. We have our frustrations at times for sure, but obviously the region thinks it's pretty cool in Issaquah. And we get a lot of positives that way, but we then get the traffic and all in providing the recreation for many people. And only our neighbors are only going to get tighter in terms of our park space and the rest. And so more and more people looking for more of an open space type environment, trails, not urban trails, but forested trails, and that are going to be more and more coming to Issaquah. There's going to be a lot more people living in Puget Sound Basin, and we're going to be the place where that kind of opportunity exists. And we've got to figure out how to make it work the best for us that stay here in the city as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
And that concludes the those in our attendees. Thank you.
Great. We appreciate, be nice to make sure people know this is going on, and we appreciate people coming on to make comments. Thank you. So that brings us to the meat of the agenda items. I believe Andrea has got a briefing on the community feedback. And we'll start there whenever Andrea is ready.
Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to also introduce our management analyst, Jean Paul. Jean, you want to give a wave? Thanks, Jean. Jean you're going to be seeing a little bit more of Jean throughout the task force process. Jean's been with the city for, I'm going to say 3 years. I kind of forget. 3 years. Okay, good. He's nodding. And he's done all kinds of stuff for us. And so really happy to welcome him as an additional support for this task force. Jean's going to be pulling up the slides, I think, to share the presentation with everybody. So we'll wait on those slides to come up. And you'll be hearing from Jean a little bit later in the presentation, summarizing some of the community feedback that we've heard. So as we switch topics from finance, as we discussed last time, to our priorities, one of the things we wanted to make sure that you had background on are, what have we heard from the community to date? And so we'll be providing a little bit more information about that. That's what Jean will handle. And here come the presentation slides. Great, thank you, Jean. I think we're ready for the next slides, please. Great. So the purpose of this evening is really to begin to discuss the question of how do we determine these priorities. And when we talk about priorities, we're really focusing on those buckets that Mayor Polly mentioned in our first meeting. That's in our CIP, they are defined, capital improvement plan, they are defined, transportation, projects, facilities, related projects, parks and trails, utilities. We're not going to address equipment at this time because equipment is As I said in our first meeting, it's just the needs in terms of dollar amounts just are not at the scale of the other needs that we've identified. So as we focus on these buckets of projects today, we're not focusing on individual projects. When we talk about priorities, we want to keep the discussion pretty high level in terms of how do we prioritize among these buckets, these 4 buckets. And when we talk about the word priority, I want us to be thinking about what should we consider our immediate, medium term, or long term? What do we do first, second, or last? And we're going to talk a lot more about what that word priority means a little bit later on in the evening today, but I don't want us to conflate priority with what's the most important, because I think we can determine there's a lot of considerations in terms of what we would want to take on first, second, third, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But all of this is to say that the purpose of tonight is really begin to discuss that question. How do we determine what do we do first, second, third, etc.? Next slide, please, Jean. And so how we're going to get there, so like I was saying, first we're going to talk about what community feedback have we heard so far and give you some background on that. This is feedback we've heard from the process that we undertook for the strategic plan. What parts of that feedback can we apply for this process? What have we heard through the community survey? What have we heard from the community also, since the pandemic started? So all of those things we'll go over today. And then we'll revisit that discussion that we had 2 meetings ago about engagement. I asked you, how would you like to engage the public through this task force process? And so given all of the things that we've heard from the community so far in terms of feedback, what would be helpful for you and your purpose as this task force to make those recommendations on priorities? What do you need to know and what do you need to hear from the community? So we'll have an opportunity to discuss that. And then we'll provide some more background on criteria that have been used from other efforts, not just transportation related efforts, but and talk about what are these criteria and considerations that we have worked from. How can we possibly apply some of those criteria, which of those criteria sound appealing, and just use that background to really jumpstart our brainstorm, which is where we'll end the evening on what types of considerations or criteria should we be thinking of to help us get to that priority question of what buckets of projects should come first, second, third, etc. That's really what we're doing tonight. A lot packed in, and so let's get started. With that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Jean.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jean Paul. As Andrea indicated, I'm a management analyst in the mayor's office. And tonight I'm going to be sharing some background information on the community feedback that we've already received regarding infrastructure. The first area where this has happened is the city's strategic plan. And the plan was developed from March of 2018 to May of 2019. And community engagement really happened throughout the entire process. The city staff and consultants really tried to cast a wide net to get feedback from as many different people and parts of the city as possible. And throughout the process, they held 15 community pop-up meetings, 19 focus groups, and had 2 online surveys that garnered over 1,600 responses. So this graphic summarizes the entire strategic plan on one page. And for those of you less familiar with the strategic plan, it has 6 goal areas, which are found at the bottom of the page. These goal areas are where the city focuses its attention when it comes to implementing the plan. Even though there's 1 goal dedicated to infrastructure, at least 5 of the 6 actually deal with infrastructure in some way. For example, mobility includes transportation infrastructure. The growth and development topic includes planning for the infrastructure like utilities needed to develop central Issaquah. The environmental stewardship goal includes acquisition of land for park, trail, open space, and critical areas. The city leadership and services goal includes an evaluation of the condition and performance of current city facilities. And finally, there's the infrastructure goal itself, which was made a separate goal to ensure the maintenance, repair, and replacement of all infrastructure was also prioritized. As far as the engagement itself, the city received the greatest amount of feedback on the topics of growth and development and mobility. Within the topic of mobility, residents generally split their comments between controlling existing traffic, advocating for more infrastructure, or getting people out of their cars. The infrastructure goal itself generally received the least amount of engagement, and comments provided were most related to recreational buildings. Besides the strategic plan, the city has also gotten feedback from residents through the community survey. The survey was first conducted in 2015 and has been performed every 2 years since then. Because of the sample size and the methods used, the survey results are considered a statistically valid representation of the entire community. The most recent survey was conducted in the spring of this year. For the first time, it had questions and methods built into the survey to help identify community priorities more clearly than previous surveys. One of the ways that the survey tried to identify priorities was first by asking how satisfied residents were with city services, and then asking which services should receive emphasis over the next 2 years. This slide shows where residents felt emphasis should be placed, and there are a few arrows next to infrastructure-related items at the top of the list. The company that performed the survey and analyzed the results also has a tool to recommend priorities for investments. Because all cities generally have limited resources, the tool prioritizes investment in the services that are most important to residents, but where they're least satisfied. The consultants had a simple formula that provides an importance satisfaction rating, which is found in the second column from the right of the slide. The recommendations for emphasis are based on those ratings and are color-coded, where anything is in red is considered a definitely increase emphasis area. The orange color is considered increase emphasis, and the green is considered maintain emphasis. So to walk through an example of the top row, the flow of traffic was considered the #1 item for importance, with the lowest satisfaction of the 16 choices for major city services in the survey question. Because of that, it would be the top recommendation for investments in major city services. There are also ratings prepared for each of the other strategic plan goal areas, and I'll have a few more later on in the slides.
Jean, are you taking questions, or do you want everyone to hold their questions?
Sure, I can pause and we can handle the questions as they come up.
Let's go to Councilmember Goodman and then Brad Book.
Thank you, Stacy here. So Jean, I was curious. So it says the community survey for 2021, and can you just give us a little bit of information about what the thoughts are about the effect that the pandemic might have had on the community survey, and particularly with regard to traffic and congestion, because for a good part of that time, people were off the streets, particularly in it's been so long now, 2020. So I'm wondering if it's possible that it's even, some of these might even be, anyway, that's just my thought, that maybe people are more even less concerned in the survey because there would be less traffic, and so maybe in actuality people are more concerned. So that's kind of a question, I guess.
So Councilman Goodman, yes, there were questions that were related to the pandemic, but I think most of them were related to how confident kind of people felt in the city's response, how difficult their individual lived experiences were from the pandemic. I don't know if there were questions that kind of identified what you might be kind of getting at, where there were different priorities because of the pandemic in terms of city services. I do know we have, go ahead.
I think my real question is about if we're asking people in the middle of a pandemic when there's not much traffic congestion, you know, I do know that traffic congestion has been an issue the #1 issue in Issaquah for 30 years. But when traffic is off the streets and we're doing a community survey, does that skew the survey results? So people aren't having trouble getting around town because nobody's on the streets. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And so maybe there isn't an answer but I'm just thinking, looking at the results of a survey, that maybe where there was some sort of maybe they could have been potentially skewed because there wasn't anybody on the streets for a lot of the pandemic. So maybe, so I don't know if anybody ever talked about that behind the scenes, but that's just what I was thinking about.
And I
If I
see
may-
deputies. Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
Thanks, Jean. I think it's a good question that you raised of how the pandemic may have changed people's attitudes about some of the services or infrastructure that we have. I think what we're still seeing, regardless of the pandemic and the lower levels of traffic that occurred last spring, there's still a very low level of satisfaction. So I don't know that it had such a skewing effect on people's level of satisfaction with the roads, though it is a good topic to think about for other infrastructure as well as we talk about parks. Parks had, I think, greater importance, what we heard from the community during the pandemic, because it was the one place people could go, right? And so, certainly attitudes, preferences have been changing as a result of the pandemic. How many of those will be sustained is difficult to tell. Certainly what we've been hearing is that those traffic levels today are just about on par with what we'd seen pre-pandemic times as well. So something very good to consider is, how has the pandemic changed some of these attitudes? What can we also think about in this post-pandemic world, knowing that it will be changed in terms of what people's preferences are, travel patterns, et cetera. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise it as a question in my mind. Thank you.
Go ahead, Brad. And then Jamie right after Brad.
Okay. Actually, my question relates to this particular slide and the one before it. And so the slide before this one actually kind of gave a breakdown there of parks and sustainable environmental quality being real close together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It looks like parks is the fifth line item down on that particular slide. So if you go to the next slide, which is kind of where we get stuck here, I'm not seeing parks anywhere actually on this slide, and I guess that's my question. Why is parks not on this slide?
So the simple answer is just I trimmed some of the content to make it a little more readable for the slide deck. There were 16 options, and it made it a little bit difficult to see all of it on one slide. So the parks are definitely on there. However, they're not prioritized in the top 10. So it would be in that 11 through 16 ranking when the consultants kind of compared the importance and satisfaction of park services. So
why? So I guess my question, in that previous slide, it looks like parks is rated within the top 10. Why is it not in the top 10 in this slide?
Sure, and I can even maybe jump ahead one slide. So essentially, people are satisfied. It's both important and they are satisfied with the services. And because the tool the consultants have, it prioritizes where satisfaction is low. In their analysis, they would continue emphasis for parks, but they would not add further emphasis to parks. They would, according to their metric, recommend you focus on areas where residents are less satisfied. So essentially, they would say, stay where you're at, and if you have the option, spend money elsewhere where people are less satisfied. And in this instance, those are traffic related. So that's just what that tool is saying.
Well, but again, sustainable environment is showing up there similar to parks in that slide. And the previous slide, environment is showing up as a rating within the top 10. And then again, I guess that's, if you're using that comparison, I guess I'm still not sure why parks is not showing up as in the top 10.
And like I said, it really just comes down to residents are satisfied enough that it doesn't kind of meet that low satisfaction threshold where the consultants were looking for emphasis. So it really just means the city and the residents are relatively both feeling that it's important and that they're satisfied with the services being provided. So it is certainly not to say that parks are not important. They are important, but and the survey supports that information. It's really just the satisfaction isn't low enough for this formula that the consultants use, that it kind of doesn't trip the threshold to say it requires further emphasis.
I hear you, but I guess I'm still not on page with it. But thank you, Gene.
Hi, Gene. Jamie speaking. I had a question about whether this survey and past surveys were structured in a way that you could kind of trend these ratings, or I guess the importance / satisfaction over time. And this kind of speaks a little bit to Councilmember Gooden, her question around this moment in time versus where have we been in the past. I would be interested if we did have the ability to look at these importance ratings and satisfaction ratings trended over time. So I don't know, is there anything that would allow us to do that, or are they so different that that's not possible?
So for 2021, we used a new company for the very first time. The first 3 surveys in 2015, 17, and 19 were performed by the same company. But for 2021, we opted to go with a different company that actually allowed us to ask these questions about importance and satisfaction at the same time. So there is certainly satisfaction information in those previous surveys, and there might be areas that are close enough where you could see trends between the different surveys. But the exact comparison of like this information, this is the first year where we have the information presented in this way.
Thank you, Gene.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is another way to display the satisfaction and importance data that the survey captured, and this is just a visual representation. So for this graph, the satisfaction rating is on the vertical axis and the importance rating is on the horizontal. And the area on the bottom right is where high importance and low satisfaction services are depicted. And that's where the tool recommends placing emphasis. And that top right area, as I mentioned before, are areas of both high importance and high satisfaction where the survey data recommends continuing emphasis. As I mentioned before, importance and satisfaction rankings were prepared for each of the strategic plan goal areas. I've pulled out the goal areas that highlight where infrastructure is above the threshold for recommended emphasis, and mobility is the first of those goal areas. While the city doesn't control all of the factors behind these services, there are a number of infrastructure areas and mobility that meet the threshold for emphasis. Environmental stewardship is the next goal area with an infrastructure recommendation. In this case, there's only one, the preservation of open space, which is tied to the land acquisitions that are found in the CIP. Finally, for the infrastructure goal area, street repair and sidewalks are identified as areas for emphasis from the survey. I do want to point out I've presented just a small section of the information available from the survey, and I encourage everyone to go to the website and interact with this dashboard tool. It allows you to click through the different topics and filter the data in a number of different ways so you can kind of dig into the results for yourself. And the link for the dashboard was included in the packet for tonight's meeting. A couple of final considerations when it comes to previous community engagement. The first is that the timeline does not always look as far into the future as this task force may need. The 2019 strategic plan had a 5-year time frame, and the community survey only asked about the next 2 years. At the same time, the pandemic has also shifted some of the priorities, which we've spoken about to Councilmember Goodman's question. And as Deputy City Administrator Snyder highlighted, one of the areas that we've seen a shift is how parks and outdoor recreation became even more important during the pandemic. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'll hand it back to Deputy City Administrator Snyder and the chair for the discussion questions.
Thank you, Gene. Before we get on to the discussion questions, are there any other questions from the information that Gene just presented on feedback we've heard from the community? Okay. So moving on from that, given all that we've heard from the community and thinking about our first meeting where we talked about public engagement as it relates to the work of this task force, I wanted to revisit some of those discussions because you had a really good brainstorm of many different ideas for community engagement throughout the task force process. We talked about surveys and videos, and the other thing that was mentioned is before we engage the public to really have a clear understanding of what it is that what information we really need to hear from them and what our goals of that outreach would be, and then who we really want to talk to or who we really want to hear from. And so I thought on the heels of hearing what we've heard so far in terms of community feedback, for the purposes of this task force to provide recommendations on our priorities, what kind of community feedback do you need in order to provide those recommendations? And this is a question that I'd love for us to discuss now. It could be that as we continue the discussion tonight, that there is additional things that you think of and say, you know, actually, it would be great to know this, or we need to know that too. And so always happy to take those ideas, but I thought I'd pause and have a special moment tonight where we consider that question. And then the next question would also be, once we figure out, you know, what it is that we would actually like to hear and understand from the community for your own purposes of making your recommendations, then who do we want to hear from? So I would like to open it up at this time for your thoughts.
Hey, this is Tim Flood. So I'm glad we got a little sense of some of the survey data that we had previously. And based on that, I think it's important that as we go back out to the community, we definitely want to have their involvement and their input here. It's more, it should be less open-ended, right? I think we've asked a lot of open-ended questions with these type of surveys, and we've got a lot of data to work with right now. It would make more sense to go back to the community at this point, in my opinion, with sort of, here's what we have in mind, here's our list, what do you think of this? Rather than leave it open-ended again, and then we come back and then ask them, what do you think of our list? We've got a lot of data there. As Councilman Goodman said, the priorities have been pretty consistent over the years. And so I think as we've gone through that exercise repeatedly with these surveys and these plans, this is sort of the next domino to fall, right? So that one is a lot of survey, a lot of community engagement. Now here's what we're gonna do in response to it.
Brad?
Yeah, I like what Tim just said, and also what Stacy said previously. I guess my comment about feedback from the community at this point would be really more broadly how COVID has impacted what people feel about all of these topics. And, you know, rather than to start all over again and reinvent, kind of like what Tim was talking about, we can rely upon that data and actually see if COVID has actually change some of those preferences from the community's perspective, and not only just from transportation. I mean, I think across the board in all the areas, I think COVID has changed people's lives, you know, and likely probably more long term in some respects. And so I think getting a feel for that across all of the various topics would be beneficial.
Jason, then Jamie, then Susan.
Thank you, Chair Crass, and I'm just going to kind of echo Mr. Brooks and Mr. Flood's comments. It seems at this point, our task force is only meant to convene for about 5 months. So we can start the whole process over, start doing surveys again, or we can take this incredible amount of data that we have right now, try and dig into the weeds, because yes, I know the pandemic's changed a lot, but to Deputy Administrator Snyder's point, we're already seeing basically activity levels back to pre-pandemic 2019 levels. It's not a bad question to ask. I think we have a plenty of amount of data to start moving forward. And I do like Mr. Flood's point is maybe after we've kind of prioritized what our buckets are, what our priorities are, how we are going to divvy these up, then maybe a simple survey to see if we're on the right track. But I think, again, starting from scratch when we already have so much information to work with is just going to put us back another month and a half. And then we have to go through the data, then we have to look at the data. And again, a lot of these answers are pretty consistent. It's not a shocker, I think, to any of us here that traffic, again, scores number one. Parks and open spaces, this is all echoing things I think all of us have heard for years and years. I didn't see anything jump completely out of proportion or jump the line. Parks, like they said, you know, that makes sense. People are a little bit more in outdoors, probably will be for the next few years. But I like the idea of taking the data that we have now, synthesizing it, and let's get some points on the board, and then maybe following that up with a small survey to see if we're going in the right direction. I think that's probably more appropriate. And then as far as, just because I'm talking, I guess I'll go with question number 2. As far as people to hear from, I think the transportation board would obviously be interesting to hear from about what they believe might be prioritized, or I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later about what's more impactful. And then also hearing from the capital facilities manager at the city, same questions, you know, what's priority, what's impactful. We know that even though our buildings aren't falling down, if we neglect them, they become much more expensive to take care of in the future. So I think there's a lot, like I said, we'll continue the discussion throughout the evening, but that's kind of where I'm thinking as far as the data. I think we have a lot to work with at this point.
Hi, Jamie speaking. I think one of the things that I do want to caution on, and I feel like after going through the first slides that that Jean took us through, we have a lot of data on what's important. I'm not sure we have a really closely defined problem in any one of these areas. And so taking, for example, land use and planning is one of the highest priority, lowest satisfaction areas. I didn't see any questions that really clearly defined what people wanted, like what needs to improve. And so I think my concern is that we have in the CIP a list of solutions. What I don't know is that we have a really clearly defined problem for each one of these priorities. And so that would be my concern, is if we didn't get further data. I haven't seen anything that says this is clearly the problem, like traffic flow, for example, or any of these things. How do we make sure that what we're proposing funding is, and how we're focusing on these areas, are going to solve the problem? And I think that gets to the second question, which is, I do think what Jason was mentioning around getting some of the experts, but also trying to get feedback beyond just the transportation board on where do we feel like the pain points. So taking transportation, I know the stormwater master planning, they had feedback from the city or from citizens on where are the specific problems that we have, and how do we, I think there's a mixture of how do we get that feedback along with the transportation board and the city officials that have a more overarching perspective, and then marry the two into making sure that what we're prioritizing is solving the problems that both the experts and the people on the ground are kind of the experts in their experience are feeling. Thank you.
And hi, this is Susan. I really appreciate all the prior comments, and I agree with most of what's been said. You know, my eye is just really going to that lower right quadrant, the opportunities for improvement, and that coupled with the long-standing issue with flow of traffic, congestion, and management on Issaquah city streets. I feel like this is just our moment in time to make a difference here. And I would love to know more about how we could start making a difference, because there's a little bit of data in here about infrastructure, sidewalks, etc. But I guess I don't know if among our citizens, is this going to be, you have to fix the major problem or you're not going to get credit for any of it? Or could we actually drive that satisfaction up by addressing maybe a few smaller ancillary type situations here? So I guess I'm really interested to know, for those who are most impacted by this and who are screaming at us to improve the flow of traffic and congestion, what is our avenue for making it better? And I don't know. I mean, I know that's a complex issue. I know it's not just Issaquah, it's our surrounding communities, but I would love to know, again, from the people who are giving us this feedback, if we made it 10% better, or are you telling me, like, hey, if you can't make it 100% better, don't even bother. If you can't build a highway, past Front Street, don't even bother. I guess I just want to know, like, what's the success criteria that we're going to be facing in the minds of our citizens for this? And again, the only thing that comes to mind is the people who are impacted most by it. I don't know exactly how to find those people, but I really would like to begin this as kind of a dialogue so that we kind of know what to aim for to really move the needle in this quadrant. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to call on Kathy. Am I saying it right, McCory?
Yes. Thank you, Cynthia. I love the conversation here. Love all of everyone's comments. I think there's a couple other pieces of data that are out there that might be brought forth from the city. I remember a survey pre-pandemic that was about pinch points when it comes to transportation. I know that there's been some other studies done around transportation, and if that's a major issue, I'd like to see more of that data brought forth, because I think that would help us, again, get to the point where we're establishing priorities. And along with that, to be able to establish priorities of our list that we're working on, is I do think that a question back out to the public might be appropriate in that COVID has changed things. We know what the surveys are showing us as to what is the greatest concern. But if I'm going to say, for instance, that transportation is my greatest concern, well, how do I see myself working through it over the next couple years? So it might be one question that helps identify what changes have been going on. So am I going to work from home now? Is it the fact that I'm homeschooling my children? Is it a fact that I'm changing jobs and I'm not going to be taking the same routes anymore? I mean, we can, what are those future trends? We know what the issues are, but what are our residents' future trends? What do they see themselves doing, or how do they see themselves commuting when we ask that question 2 years down the line? How do you see yourself getting around town, or how do you see yourself working through the transportation challenges that you say exist? That to me would help me, again, look at the list we've got in front of us and help prioritize things if I know what's in their minds and their thinking that they're going to have to do given a current situation, because some of these projects are going to take a few years to get to and or get done. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm calling myself next. This is Cynthia speaking. So I don't have a direct answer to the question, and I kind of want to just share some of the things that I've been wrestling with. And that is, and I love this slide that shows the grid. I mean, that the quadrants, that's really, really important. It's really, really interesting to see that the consultant came back and said, we recommend this be the high priority to ease congestion, but there's a problem in that transportation engineers, transportation planners understand that you cannot really build your way out of congestion. You cannot really solve congestion. If you look at the master mobility plan, you can look at the whole plan and, on the guiding principles, you won't see anything about reducing car traffic, congestion for drivers. There's improved mobility, but I feel like I just kind of need to comment a little bit on the elephant in the room. And the same thing, with last week or last time we met, when we talked about why the measure failed. People know that it's not going to solve congestion. And so I don't know, I'm a little I'm probably going to say things like it's the wrong thing, but it's of limited value to listen to people talk about how important easing congestion is when we really can't deliver it. And so I just want to lay that out there, a little bit of the elephant in the room. Like, I don't have an answer. I don't know. I think one of the biggest problems with capital finance and some of the things, the options that we discussed before, and this biggest priority. And I think maybe, you know, that's what we wrestled with putting together the master mobility plan. And, you know, it got passed, and nowhere does it say reduce vehicular congestion in the master mobility plan. So I'm going to leave it at that and just kind of leave it out there. But it's challenging, and every transportation planner in, you know, the modern world faces this challenge. So I'm going to stop there and call on. And by the way, Stacy has mentioned several times to call her Stacy. I like to be called Cynthia. I like to call people what they want to be called. Some people like to use the more formal. I'm going to just try to listen for how people like to address them in that way. You can call me Cynthia, and I'm going to call, I think she said to call her Stacy, so I turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy here. Yes, call me Stacy. Stacy is my name. And that's wonderful. Council member stuff is way too formal for me. Boy, I just love all the conversation, and you'd think that some people might think, oh, well, you might have heard all this before. No, you know, we don't have on the council an opportunity to deep dive most of the time into topics, and you know, we rely on a lot of other groups to help us out. I don't think Cynthia said anything to be concerned about at all. I think that is part of the elephant in the room. And yes, we've heard that you can't build your way out of congestion. And you know, we also heard from Dave Kapler tonight, who's been involved at the city levels for very, very long time and knows his stuff. That I hadn't really thought about it in the way that he put it, in that when we get, if we get the light rail here, what I call our city, which is a regional intersection, is probably just going to get worse with people making their way to wherever that station is going to be, without any, because there aren't any places anywhere else that are substantial at all for people to park and then maybe get ferried to the station here. But I'm wondering if, and then when Cynthia mentions talk of easing congestion is of limited value when we can't solve it, I think that's a really a place to start about helping us with, what problem are we trying to solve? And when you think about that, along with Susan's thoughts about what's the success criteria, and what does the community expect in order for us to move the needle, if you put those together and people understand a little bit that you can't solve it, what makes a difference to them in terms of congestion, I think is really insightful. And it, in a different way, the mayor and I talked for a long time, and not that it was necessarily our idea or hers or mine, I'll just relay the conversations about maybe another way of thinking about it is, if you can't get rid of congestion and the regional traffic, then do you have some sort of, and control is not the right word, but do you prioritize internal mobility in some ways over regional traffic? And do you protect neighborhoods, try to protect neighborhoods from the cut through regional traffic that we hear about a lot from folks? So those are some conversations we've had about ways of dealing with it that isn't solving it, but just kind of handling it differently. I, for example, am a complete freak in that I love traffic circles. I mean, you could have whatever you want to call them, traffic circles, roundabouts. I mean, I would have one every, not literally, but I would have one every 20 feet. I think they're just super cool. And so that can help, meter traffic, and there may be more places to put that. But I do think, I look at some of the comment, and I love we need less open-ended questions. I've been kind of involved at this level or another similar level for a very long time. And we have open questions ad nauseum, and we kind of just seem to regurgitate the same questions and get the same answers. And we're kind of stuck with, well, what are we going to do about it? Anyway, I don't have a total answer either, but I'm loving all of the conversation here and the comments. And when I put a few of them together, some things start to gel in my mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Voice.
So the last three comments were fantastic. And one thing that keeps popping in my mind, and not to use a military analogy, but I will, is, 90% of mission failure is not having a clear objective. And I think, so that's one thing, when we're looking at these different things, infrastructure, I think that's really important, right? You can't build your way out of congestion. But we also know that there's certain things that add to congestion: potholes, poor roads, misplaced crosswalks, things like that. So even though we're still going to have to take an influx of another 10,000 people over the next so many years, you're right, these lanes aren't going to overnight just become 2-lane highways into 4-lane highways. But even if we can't build our way out of congestion, if we were not keeping up in terms of the infrastructure, it can definitely add to it. So I think just knowing what we're trying to accomplish, like I said, if we're saying X amount % should go into the bucket of infrastructure, like I said, just understanding clearly, you're right, you're not going to be able to build your way out of another 10,000 people moving to the city over the next 10 to 15 years. But by not taking care of some of these things, we can definitely add to travel times. Thank you.
Brad, go ahead, and then I want to do a time check because we've got a couple people have had made comments on this topic. So I want to ask Andrea if it's do we want to move on right after Brad, unless there's somebody that hasn't spoken yet on this topic. Thanks.
Thanks, Cynthia. Actually, Stacy mentioned something that triggered me to make a comment here, and that was about internal mobility. Given that congestion is such a problem that we may not be able to change, drastically in the near future, internal mobility, may be a real area of focus for a priority. And I bring that up because it was one of our real strong elements in the park strategic plan that we developed here a few years ago, about creating a north-south, east-west corridors. And frankly, if we were to have those corridors in place, it would really benefit an internal mobility system where people could connect to these corridors either by walking or bikes or other types of transportation alternatives other than cars, and actually be able to manipulate through the city fairly easily without having to use a car or actually even touch the road system. And that may actually be something that's a lot more in the city's control, is to put a priority on these corridors, that would help alleviate our mobility problems. So I guess that's what I would like to comment on. Thanks.
Thanks. And then we did Councilmember Hall, yeah. And then it looks like we don't have any other comments, so probably move on after that. Thanks. Unless Parker has something to say.
And thank you, Cynthia. And feel free to call me Zach. Zach's fine. And I'll be super brief because I've been really enjoying the conversation. So I won't +1 to anything I've heard, although +1 to almost everything I've heard. I just wanted to say, I think in terms of specific feedback, I think would be interesting too is how should we consider equity in this space in our recommendations? So I know the equity board was just formed. They're gonna have a lot to do. So maybe we could get some feedback from the administration as to whether or not they could consider that question of how equity could be considered, or does equity need to be considered in our recommendations at all? So that's the only other thing I would add.
Just in quick response, Councilmember Hall, this is Andrea. Just in quick response, yes, equity needs to be considered in this process. I think that's part of our process and policies, certainly moving forward, and so we need to consider that. But I think it would be an interesting discussion as we talk about criteria, how we define equity, and there may be some resources we can draw upon that, but there's many considerations under that kind of capital E equity, right? And so that can be part of our future discussions as well. Great point. With that, great discussion, everybody. I took all kinds of notes. I haven't handwritten a whole bunch in the past couple of years, but my hand's a little hurting, but that's a good sign from all these great ideas and thoughts. I really appreciate that discussion. Jean, if you can pull up the slides again, then we can kind of continue through to the next part where we talk about those priorities. And I think there was already some dabble in priority talk through that discussion, which was good, so that we can shift gears rather smoothly to that prioritization criteria. So one of the things I wanted to say is, as we consider our main task for the evening, how do we prioritize these needs that we want to tackle first, second, and third? I wanted to also just mention that this task force is really the only appointed body we have to take a global look at what our infrastructure needs. And so while many of you come with perspectives and certain concentrations of knowledge and expertise on transportation or parks or other things, this body is really to help us figure out priorities among those buckets of needs, and to think more globally and provide direction to the mayor, recommendations to the mayor, and recommendations to City Council about how we choose among those needs, right? So just wanting to emphasize that that's a unique charge for this group, that TAB is more on the very specific granular level. Parks board the same, right? And so that's where this group really differs. So again, as I talked about in the beginning, prioritization, how we're going to use it here for our purposes to really think about what comes first, second, or third. I really want to avoid thinking about what's important and what's not important, because we want to be a little bit more strategic in calling things important or not. Really, the reality is that all of these needs are very important to Issaquah's high quality of life. And so, so I'd really rather we think about what should come first, second, or third. And so these prioritization criteria that we're about to run through are really just to start your thinking process on what kind of criteria you think we should develop for your recommendations. Give examples. These criteria have been used before, adopted before by various city processes, but they're mostly at the project level. So as we go through, I'd like for you to consider how can they pertain to more of those buckets or groups of projects? How can they, and which of these resonate with you? Which of them don't resonate with you? So this is really just a starter area to see how these other criteria that we've used in the past can be helpful for your purposes. That's all. So next slide, please. So some examples of prioritization criteria that we've used in the past. This is with a strategic plan, to think about what gets into the strategic plan, what types of strategies and actions do not make the strategic plan, things that we considered are level of impact. I've heard a few of you mention impact this evening, and so that's one thing that's considered in the strategic plan. Control over outcome, how much control or influence do we have? Cynthia mentioned earlier, controlling congestion and traffic and solving that is nearly impossible. Likelihood of success, cost in time and money, also something to consider. Of course, as we talk about those financing options again in a couple of weeks, that's where that comes into play. And then timing and opportunity. Some things are better timed than others. Again, things can be equally important, but Sometimes you're just at the right timing and opportunity for one thing versus another thing. Next slide, please. Also, this is examples of criteria that the Traffic Task Force used a couple of years ago to determine which projects they would put in relation to the bond measure and which projects maybe wouldn't make the bond measure, right? So this again was on a project level, and what we're thinking about is how might these apply to that higher level of those buckets. So the Traffic Task Force used criteria of focusing on places where Issaquah drivers are having difficulties, so those pain points. I think I heard that mentioned a little earlier in your discussion, pain points. Making sure local funding can do the job if grants don't become available, so not relying on grants. Again, it's that financing piece of how would that be financed. Emphasize projects with a big visual impact. Pick projects that will enjoy strong community support. What we're talking about here, of course, the Traffic Task Force is they determined projects that would go in a bond that was required to be voter supported, right? So picking projects that have strong community support was important for them. Support non-motorized travel and be cognizant of the concurrency obligation. And we haven't talked about concurrency and transportation, but that was not super directly relevant for our purposes today. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that in a few weeks, but that was one of the criteria that they had for their purposes. Next slide, please. And then we have the the Capital Improvement Plan, the CIP. We went over these in the first meeting, if you recall. These are the criteria that the projects needed to have in order to get into the CIP. So before projects are even included, whether funded or not, they are vetted according to some criteria. And again, thinking about how these criteria that fit the projects that we are looking to fund, how could this be kind of rolled up into a higher level or help guide your thinking today about priorities? So addressing life and safety concerns, community priority, again, that's really stemming from what we've heard from the community in terms of how important this is to them. Conformity to strategic plan goals, something that would have a positive environmental impact or avoid a negative environmental impact. And what the potential funding source was, if funding was readily available. And does, for the purposes of CIP, the question that they ask is, does this project replace or repair existing infrastructure? So again, keeping in mind not just new infrastructure, but how to maintain our existing infrastructure is also a criteria to get into the CIP Capital Improvement Plan. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So, those are just some samples of criteria to start kind of your brain turning for this brainstorm that we're about to have. But before we get to that, again, I just want to emphasize priority does not equal importance. Really want to stay away from what's important and what's not important. I think all of these projects are important for a complete and whole quality of life. It's really a matter of what do we determine, how do we determine what happens first, second, third, etc. And so just as illustration of how priority does not equal importance in this case, we have a number of obligations that are mandated. And so you could say, well, our mandated obligations are the most important because we have to do them. But something that may be mandated, like let's say fire protection services, it is not the same as something that was on that chart that Jean showed us in that lower right-hand quadrant of low satisfaction, high priority, right? It's certainly a high priority, but people are very satisfied with it. So, so some of these considerations and criteria are may differ, and you could define importance in all these different ways. So that's why I want to stay away from the words what's important, what's not important, and that frame of thinking. I really want us to think about all these things that are important. How do we figure out what happens first, second, and third? And other considerations that we've already talked about, what will get voter supported if needed? In the past, as we've talked about in previous meetings, successful levies and voter approved debt have been for fire stations and parks. The transportation bond failed. right? And so that's something to consider for this group. And I know we've also, in previous discussion, talked about, I think it was Tim Flood who said we want to have something that's really bold and visionary and will be a game changer, something large and ambitious. And our past efforts when we've gone to the voters have been small, relatively small and defined. And so there's different ways that you can look at this. And I just wanted to kind of jumpstart the conversation on considerations or priorities for how to think about what should come first, second, and third. And so next slide, please. So really, that's the discussion, and we have the rest of the evening to think about this and brainstorm what are those criteria. So how do we determine what buckets, transportation, facilities, parks, and trails or utilities come first, second, or third? And, we talked about utilities a little bit in our first meeting. I think Jason Boyce mentioned, was asking questions, why would we consider utilities? Utilities do not have any unfunded projects because we have assigned, we pay for the capital improvements related to utilities through the rates that we charge ratepayers, people receiving those utility services. And so that might be something that you would want to discuss and say, do we even need to consider utilities as part of this process, or is that not a priority at this time? Feedback from you on that would be really helpful. But at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Cynthia and the rest of you for a discussion, unless there's any questions.
I see Susan has a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to follow up on that last slide where you talked about mandated. So to me, that's a little bit troublesome because I feel like mandated is mandated. Mandated is required. And so it seems to have its own dimension. And I don't know that we should necessarily combine it with the other things. Like if you think about it at a very high level of required versus discretionary, you pull from two separate budgets in your mind, even though they may, be overarching, have one budget, but I don't know that you're asking us to decide that we're going to not deliver on something that's mandated, because that could have all kinds of consequences. We could, I don't know what, I won't go there, but if we have the funding to do it and it's paid by others and it's viewed as a priority by the community, like why wouldn't we do it? And if we don't, we totally lose the opportunity and lose the money. We can't spend it and anything else. To me, those should be like in one column. And then anything, again, that's absolutely mandated by law, that should also be in another column. And I think what we should be looking at are the items and compare them across of the things that are, for lack of a better term, discretionary, meaning, nobody's going to die if we don't do them. But, it's like, well, which is, like you said, a higher priority relative to the feedback that we've gotten. So I'd like some feedback on how you're viewing those things and if we can kind of separate those.
Well, I think it's a good question, and I'd really like to turn it back over to the group. So I think one option is that you can say, well, we want to know what all of those mandated obligations are and have an understanding of what those things are and what options would be to fund those mandated obligations when we talk about capital infrastructure, right? Another thing that the group can discuss is how do you balance those things, right? How do you balance some of those mandated needs with discretionary funds, with discretionary needs, and then fund those things, right? So I think that's mandated certainly can be one of your criteria. How does it balance with these other things? And then asking, certainly please ask whatever information you need from the administration to figure out how to do that balance, right?
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I think I had some thoughts just in terms of prioritization. I think those 5 kind of factors of prioritization make a lot of sense. For me, the one that bubbles up to the top is what will pass, right? And that encompasses a lot of those things. It's sort of a tough pill to swallow. I learned in that process before that the truth is, and this isn't what voters and citizens want to hear, but Cynthia was right? The most impactful projects are super expensive and regional projects, right? Route 18 and SR 900 and things that are regional, the overpass over 90, which would be huge for intra-city traffic, right? That doesn't mean we can't have an impact with the projects that we pick. I touched on it, I think, last week a little bit, but if we can be really targeted with what we do and try and give something to each constituency in the city in terms of geographic representation, there are things that we can do that, yes, for the middle third of your commute, you're going to deal with that pass-through congestion. But when you get off the exit to Tallis or the Highlands, there's some improvement that is there for our city residents that we've gone to address, right? And so what will pass, I think, is the things that are going to have tangible benefits that someone can point to and say, that's going to help me in my daily life. One other point, just on the last conversation, we were talking about public input. I think the public doesn't necessarily know if it's about traffic congestion to say, I want this, project ABC 1, 2, 3, right? They just, do I like this or not? We've got to give them some options. I think it does make sense to go to city officials and experts to understand which of these projects will actually have tangible impact and be something that we should put in front of the voters. But we shouldn't necessarily go to the voters and ask them, open-ended, what do you want us to do about congestion? We need to present them with something and let them, say yay or nay.
Brad, go ahead.
Thanks, Cynthia. Actually, I guess I'd like to just say that I think that it's also important to maybe put things in a category of short-term, mid-term, and long range. And maybe the top 3 priorities in each one of those areas. Because when it comes down to funding, a lot of times it seems like funding occurs for the short-term projects, maybe, and that's why the CIP oftentimes is funded for the next 2 years. But then when we get 2 years later and we look at this, revising the 6-year CIP again, we then focus on the next 2 years, and everything just keeps jumping in a 2-year process without really ever addressing maybe some of the midterm and long range issues, which are really sometimes the big ticket items that would really make a difference. And so, coming up with some funding strategies across the board on short, midterm, and long term could really, I think, show the community that, yeah, there are some big things, in the works, but it's going to take time in order to maybe develop the funding necessary to get there. And so establishing some funding sources now or within the next year that has some long-term consequences is needed. And if the community could actually see that, okay, this is being put in place, but they might not see anything for several years, but at least, they can actually see there's some effort making in those 3 categories. So I don't think it's as simple as just saying top 3. It's top 3 in different categories. Thanks.
Stacy?
Thanks, Stacy here. So Andrea, I think I might be confused about specifically what the question is. I'm confused by, I think, the slide that says prioritization between buckets. So I don't quite understand what that means, because that sounds to me like, how do we determine which bucket is a priority? So can you explain that a little more?
Yes, thank you. So what we're trying to have what we're focusing on tonight is not at the project level. So I don't want us to be thinking that we're picking specific projects out of the CIP to fund. Trying to really decide on a group of projects or a bucket of projects. So keeping it at the level of parks and trails, transportation, or facilities, and what are our considerations to try to prioritize between those three? Because there's different funding strategies that may be appropriate even at that kind of bucket level. And so when we talked last time about, one funding strategy for parks and trails is Metropolitan Parks District, right? One idea for funding the transportation needs might be that Transportation Benefit District and revenues associated with that. So really trying to think about where should we be focusing and when I say first, it's really to Brad's point of in the more immediate term, medium term, long term, and try to determine between those buckets of projects at this point. So I just, we can think about what those criteria are, but I just didn't want us to be thinking about project level and trying to pick projects at this point. I want us to be thinking a little higher up.
Sure, I totally get the not project level and that we're looking at criteria. I guess what confuses me is the way it's written looks like, how do we determine which bucket, which bucket is the priority right now? Are you suggesting that, because that's kind of the way it's written, how do we determine it's almost like a competition between the buckets, but that's not the way I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it as how do we prioritize, and maybe the priorities are different for each bucket. It almost sets up like a competition between buckets for me, and that's why I'm having a problem with the language that's in the slides. And maybe I'm the only one who's confused. That's the way I look at it. So I can you guys kind of look at me like I'm crazy. And I just seem a little bit confused by the language.
Well, I do think to some extent we have to look at which bucket we tackle first, because I think for us to find funding for one project from each bucket, it might be a little difficult based on the funding options that we have and how confusing that might be to voters. And so I don't want it to be necessarily a competition, more of a strategic way to try to meet some of our capital needs that are unfunded. And so how do we prioritize among those groups of projects or those buckets? I don't think I'm unconfusing things for you, Councilmember Goodman, and I'm sorry about that.
Well, I'll let other people talk, and then maybe I'll get it.
I was just going to say that I'm next on the list, and my question is very, very similar. And I'm going to, I guess, just say that I've been struggling with this because I totally understand why we don't want to talk about projects. But I feel like the pendulum swung too far and these buckets are too big. And I guess what I'd really like to know is, so one of my big things whenever I serve on an advisory board is I want to make sure I know whom I'm advising, whether they're asking for that advice. And I know this is the mayor's task force, which will ultimately come to council members, but I guess it kind of, to go way up to the 30,000 foot level, like what product are we producing and for what purpose, and whom are we advising and what do they want advice on? And I feel like if we just came back and said, hey, you should put transportation first, facilities second, parks and rec third, and or parks and trails third, and we don't care about utilities, that's a bit, obviously it's gonna be more nuanced than that, but I feel like the criteria can be really nuanced, but I feel like maybe we need to do a little more work to parse, the buckets seem too big. And I'm wondering if there's not a bucket, if each of these buckets has some sub buckets that we could maybe wrap our head around. But really it comes down to who's being advised and what they want to hear from us. I guess I'm curious. It seems like it'd be difficult what would you do with that information if we came back and said, oh, we think it's these are the buckets and this is the order and here's why? That feels like such a blunt instrument. That I don't know if I were sitting on council, whether that would be super useful to me. So Yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering from you, Andrea, or from the council, or maybe the mayor would want to weigh in, like, these buckets feel too big to me. Does anyone else agree? Especially the people we're advising.
I think this is also a process question. And so where do we go from here after we talk about buckets? And after we talk about buckets, then we can dive a little deeper and determine, okay, if we believe that, I'm not even going to name the priorities because I don't want to pretend like I know the answers. But you know, if we believe that Group A is the right bucket, and we want the city to explore these different funding mechanisms for Group A, then we can dive a little deeper into that once we determine that and say, okay, we think these projects in this bucket are really the ones to look at and the most prioritized. And so I think this group is really, again, it's the one that is the most global of all of our groups, because you all are coming with these different perspectives. And so what we haven't, in our past, we have already presupposed what those priorities are. And we've said, okay, it's going to be transportation. And we've gone forth and we've had that effort. And it wasn't successful. And so I think what we're looking for is help in determining what's the strategy, what are the next, what's the path, what are the things that we should be exploring more, and what are the things we should be exploring first. And then we can dive further into the details. And so I think this isn't the end of the conversation. If you say, okay, parks is it, or transportation is it, or facilities is it, then that will then we will have further discussions to further refine what that means. So I think that's maybe a process question. But before I talk any further, Councilmember Hall, I think you had a clarifying comment.
Yeah, this is Zach. I guess the way I'm thinking about this now, and when I was looking at the presentation beforehand, it seemed more like a thought experiment that we're all going through right now to collect useful data to move on to the next stage. So it seems to me, and Andrea, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Andrea's trying to focus our discussion on the financing part of it. Really to complement what we just had 2 weeks ago. So for example, if we're talking about how we determine which bucket should be of particular interest, one of those things might be the community survey. What did we hear from the community survey? Well, for example, one thing we heard from the community survey is that traffic and transportation is an important thing. So that might then lead us to believe that, oh, okay, well then groups of those projects we might want to fund using a funding source that we know will be effective or could be effective for that. Whereas if we just start prioritizing projects right now or prioritize within buckets, it won't necessarily lend helpful information for us to move on to the next step, which is, okay, well, how are we funding it? And how are we coming back with recommendations for funding? And now I'm seeing the mayor has turned on her camera. So now we're all in trouble.
No, oh my gosh, this is like the best conversation. A couple of council members have been telling me that this is really different than anything else they've done before. Andrea, you're doing an awesome job. She is trying to develop a tool that helps the council evaluate and be able to explain why they've made certain investments and certain proposals. And it's not easy. And I think it was really interesting when Councilmember Goodman said, it's hard to pick a bucket. And Cynthia said, that sounds like a very kind of a coarse, blunt way of doing what we're trying to do. But if I can stretch your brains just a little bit, I'm not disagreeing with anything you guys said, it's great. There are, within each of the categories of spending, there are different ways we can fund within each category. But the community values, I think what Councilmember Hall just said, were expressed pretty clearly in the community survey. And so what we're trying to do is, if I could draw it up, because I've got a picture in my head, if I could draw it up, it's being able to say transportation is important, we're going to spend some time over here with criteria. And it may fall into Brad's place of what are some easy near-term, mid-term, and then longer-term investments that we can make. So it may not be this perfect patchwork quilt or lovely decision tree that we hope, but you guys are sort of starting to get to it. So I haven't heard anything that you know, has concerned me or confused me. I think you guys are having exactly the kind of conversation that I would hope you have. But I think it's a bit of a mind bender. I mean, I think what you guys are trying to do is what council has tried to do on the dais for years. Why this over that? Why is this one getting funding this year when we want to do something else? And then I think the only other thing I wanted to add, and then I'm just going to drop back into the background and spy on you all again, is something on Susan's comment. Mandates are an interesting thing. They do not come with money, ever, usually. Sometimes maybe a little bit of money, but they also have, and I can't remember the words I just texted to Andrea, but they have, there's options within mandates. So the example I sent to Andrea was the ADA sidewalk program. Yes, we have to do it. The law says we have to do it. We have to do it by a certain year. We guys pay for it. We could get it all done in 3 years. So there's still a little bit of a flex in there in terms of with those very few dollars you have. There may be things in mandates that you are thinking about the community and deciding that we should move faster on a mandate. So I wouldn't just rule mandates out right away. They have some flex to them. They have some choices to them. So, and that's it. I'm going back into my sneaky spy mode and have a good conversation. You guys, this is just absolutely awesome.
Okay, Mr. Boyce.
Thank you. And I'm going to swing for the fences on this one. I don't know if this is what the deputy administrator wants, but it's what I wrote down, so it's what I'm going to stick with. So after looking at the survey, the way I would break this down, and I don't even know, I'd probably go 50% transportation, 30% capital finance, 20% parks. I really think utilities should be a moot point. They should pay for themselves. And so just right off the bat, that one's for me. I don't even think about it. Utilities are gone. So, and the reason I came up with those numbers is because I used the survey, right? So the 55% for the flow and traffic as a first choice, that was bigger and a larger percentage of people than any other topic as an entire whole. So if you look at that first, I believe it was the very first graph, and it shows flow and traffic 55. It shows people's who want it first, second, and third. People as a first choice had that as a bigger percentage than any second, third, or fourth. So right off the bat, I'm going to go 50% transportation. The other reason why is because it also fulfills an immediate, medium, and long-term planning goal. Facilities, we don't have any dilapidated facilities in the city that I'm aware of that are condemned or falling down. So that to me seems more like a medium-term goal. And then parks, more of a long-term goal. Like I said, the city's done a fantastic job with the parks. It's in conjunction with our green necklace. So I would put the parks at third. So again, I'm going to go 50, 30, 20. That's just kind of, again, I don't just kind of swinging for the fences here, guys. And then as far as the last couple questions, I think low satisfaction and high priority probably need to be part of the priorities. And then I liked what Tim had to say about small and defined versus large and ambitious. I like the big projects. I like the large projects, but he makes a lot of sense as those are going to be tied in with the county. They're going to be tied in with the state. Small and defined will also probably get us more of that equitable thing that everyone just brought up. I think Councilmember Hall brought up, right? So we want to spread this money around. We want to make these decisions in an equitable fashion. I think by doing small and defined projects, you're going to have more success with that than doing one major project up in the Highlands for, you know, a quarter to 25 to 30% of the population. So that was my attempt at being Babe Ruth. Thank you.
I'm going to just go out of order here real quick because it looks like Parker had a comment to share earlier and it was missed. And I'll remind you guys to make sure your 2 is set to everyone, or at least the person managing the chat, monitoring the chat. I think it defaults to Tina, maybe. So just check your default. But Parker, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me? Because last time it wasn't. All right, cool. So I was thinking, I think Jason already did a good job like narrowing down our priorities, but I was thinking that it's possible to maybe narrow down our like predetermined list of priorities even further, like environmental priorities. I was just thinking how like really much of a priority it is to us to be on our list. So it's kind of like prioritizing our priorities. It was just something I was thinking about.
I'm sorry, can I follow up? Can you describe more? You know, you mentioned environmental priorities, which I don't think has been stated yet, but just can you tell us a little bit more about your idea? You have priorities and you want to narrow them down. Can you just explain that a little
Yeah,
bit
so
more?
in one of the previous slides I saw listed, it was like environmental, and I was just thinking if it's really worth it to like be mentioned here, or like I guess it's kind of a question in a way, like how necessary it is, like environmental priorities to be on our list. But it was more of like a general thing, like just a thought.
Yeah. So if it was like an environmental criteria, if you're saying, okay, projects that we should be moving up to the front of the line are groups of projects that are have a very positive environmental impact. That's something we should really be considering. Then I think that would be a criteria that you would suggest, and you could say that that's the most important thing. One thing to consider is you may think about environmental projects, you could think about how that would apply towards a lot of different things, right? So you could say that something that would have great environmental impact might be some even transportation related projects might have a good environmental impact if they were to help shift people from cars to other modes of transportation, or some of the parks projects certainly might have a very positive environmental impact if we're preserving open space or doing other things to preserve wildlife habitat as well with our parks development. So I think it can be a criteria that we use. I would just think about how that would fit within some of the projects across the buckets. But if you're suggesting that we should have positive environmental impact, then I'm going to put that on the list. Thanks.
I'm going to jump in real quick. I'm keeping track, but Tim, it looks like maybe you don't have access to the chat. So I did see you raise your hand. We'll go Jamie, Susan, Tim, then Brad.
Thanks, Cynthia. Jamie speaking. I am similarly struggling a bit with the question that Stacy and Cynthia mentioned. I do wonder if there's a way to find kind of criteria that would apply both at the bucket level and at the project level, because ultimately I do think that, like one, for example, I have a list here, and one of them is funding viability / opportunity, and ultimately that's going to be dependent on the projects that are within the CIP within that category. So I guess that's one way that I've tried to wrap my head around it, is I'm trying to come up with criteria that would apply not only at the bucket level but also the priority level, or sorry, at the project level. And so the list of what I have on what could be priority that we should be considering as we go about evaluating which bucket, and also within those buckets the projects that help. You can either go top down or bottoms up on how we went about this, but those ones that I'm really looking at is, okay, obviously community feedback, that it should be a focus in the survey. That's one of the things that seems foundational. Conformity to strategic plan goals is the bucket, something that, and the projects within that bucket, something that we think is addressing strategic plan goals. Funding viability / opportunity. Do we believe that we have a viable path to funding these projects on the timelines that we're talking about? It doesn't matter if it's a short-term priority if we don't have a funding source that matches for that priority or that bucket. Important momentum, sequential investments, that kind of gets back to, like, are there things that we need to be investing in now? Timing, opportunity, kind of looks like that bucket or that criteria that was on, I think, the strategic plan. And then impact, like, what do we feel like? Do we feel like what we have here, this bucket and the projects within that bucket, are going to make a significant impact? And then I think one thing, especially as we look at the timing aspect, is what's the timeline to impact? So if we have an investment that we have to invest a lot at different stages and we don't see any impact till the very end, that might have a very different look and feel to something that's going to have some short wins along the way, or that it's a closer defined project. And I just think that that's something we should be taking into consideration. There's pros and cons to either, but depending on the funding sources we have available, they could have a very big impact on our ability to kind of execute and make that a viable opportunity. So those were my stab at some criteria at both at the bucket and at the then project level below that.
Am I next? So I wanted to, I like that list. I think that's a great starter list. A couple of other ideas just to add as criteria. I really like the addressing life and safety concerns. I think that just gives it a bit of weight in terms of the impact that we're talking about. So if there's anything that would sort of bubble up to the top using that criteria, I think it should be considered. And then, is there a way that we could think about opportunity cost? Meaning that if it doesn't move forward, could there be consequences down the line in terms of, I'm thinking maybe this is more of an example around infrastructure. Like if we don't fix something, then the problem could be 10x as costly, you know, or if we don't build a new firehouse, for example, you know, what could be the impact down the road? Well, we're going to have to pay 3 times as much because we won't have the land or something like that. Is there a way to kind of express that as a dimension as well? And then one other suggestion, just for consideration on process. I'm still struggling with the bucket versus the project, but I'm trying to stretch my mind. I've seen this done in the past where you actually do 2 passes. So what you might want to think about is to take those 4 buckets, or remove utilities if we don't, and then take our 3 buckets, apply these criteria independently. So you have your transportation bucket, you have your facilities bucket, et cetera. And then do your across. So I know you're trying to do across first and then down, but I'm just wondering if it might be a little bit easier for some of us who kind of think differently, if we could sort of do it as a 2-pass process, but still achieve the same goal that you're trying to get to, which is that overarching kind of organizational structure. Because you might find that, you know, priorities 1 and 2 outclass anything that's priority 1 in the other buckets, and that's how you get that kind of dimensionality. So just a thought there. Thank you.
Okay, can I respond?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yes, please. Sorry. And then Tim, you're after they're done. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Great suggestions. And because what I have been hearing a little bit of from some of you are what I would consider project criteria that could really pertain to any project under any bucket, right? So a lot of what you were suggesting, Jamie, as you said, was very similar to the CIP criteria. And by definition, all of the projects meet at least some of those criteria because they're in the CIP and that's what they need to get in the CIP. And so I think it's much harder to try to determine priorities across those topics. And that's why you're all struggling with it, right? Because it is really hard. Because we want to, it's much easier, I think, to focus on that detail, to say, well, you know, this project in this part of the city is going to have a bigger impact than this project in this part of the city. I mean, that's a little bit more tangible. And so the task we've asked of you today is hard, and that's why you're struggling. So I appreciate, I appreciate it, and I apologize for the struggle. But I think that process suggestion, Susan, might be helpful for us to be able to try to choose among these buckets rather than, I think, to walk away with, you know, 1 project out of each bucket. I don't know that that's really not a recommendation that's going to be the most actionable for us, right? So we really want to try to pick among the buckets and then details from there. So I appreciate process suggestions. Thank you.
Sorry, I've spoken more than anyone tonight, but I go first and then I hear everybody and I get these ideas. So then I want to come back. I think at this point, I like what Jason did as far as just throwing a stake in the ground and saying, here's how I see the mix of buckets. And so for me, I think all of these surveys historically have told us the citizenry is screaming about transportation. For me, I would say 70% transportation, 20% parks, 10% other. The criteria on those parks is really, in my mind, sweeteners to get people to vote for it. So some pork barrel projects for people in terms of parks that we kind of get some geographic representation. And then time sensitive land acquisition, right? So land that's not going to be there anymore, that's along the green belt, along the waterways, things like that, that we want to do sooner than later. And then I think those numbers will change as we look at the projects that are out there, right? But this is our chance to do something about transportation. That's what the citizens have asked. This should be transportation heavy. And I mean, that's my take on it, but it's borne out by the data again and again, I think, with the surveys that we've seen.
Thanks. Brad is next.
Thanks, Cynthia. Actually, I like Susan's comment about opportunity cost. Opportunity cost accounting is actually a big area in business management. It has been for a long time. And that's really something that needs to be taken a look at across the board with this. You know, one of the other areas, you know, a lot of this just is a matter of establishing priorities and then, you know, determining, you know, what the community is willing to pay for in terms of additional, some form of taxation, which is where we're going to be getting to in terms of future recommendations. And so, you know, establishing priorities is helpful, but it also needs to have some flexibility built into it. You know, one thing I guess that I would comment in that respect is timing is everything, and leverage is a big issue that needs to be considered across the board, because you may actually have a priority, you know, that's established, but you may not actually have the timing at that particular time of actually having leverage or other funding that's available, whether it be from the federal government or from the state or the county, or who knows where additional resources might come from. So some work needs to go into establishing these priorities somewhat based upon what that leverage aspect to it. You know, what is out there over the next 2-3 years potentially as additional grants or resources, you know, to pursue, you know, that could potentially move, you know, everything forward with a particular priority that would maybe have less impact to the community in terms of taxation. So, you know, I guess that's one additional cog in the wheel here, I guess, to, you know, add more confusion to getting to the bottom line of this. But I do think that that's an important element to consider. Thank you.
I'm going to skip the line here because we haven't heard a whole lot from Kathy McCory. With all due respect to Councilmember Issaquah. Thank you.
Thank you. I just love this conversation. I'm going to kind of take a spin off of what Jason and Tim started. I'm not going to say percentage-wise. I'm just going to rank my buckets. And I agree because of all of the surveys we've had from the community. Transportation is obviously number one. I'm going to rank facilities as number 2, and that is because Issaquah tends to be mostly entirely built out. And long-term, we're going to need some serious redevelopment. And the best way I know to get there, and that will also help generate actually parks and mobility, is if we invest in our aged city facilities. And I never know which one to call it, but the one over by Holiday Inn has got to go. If we could find funding to do something beautiful and really represent Issaquah and provide the green and the trail and the accessibility, that sets the tone for years to come. And The other thing I'd like to say about facilities is I don't know what bucket it actually is in, but I think that internet and connectivity has to be in that bucket. Because that's the other thing is as we all move to working from home and using 6-7 computers at home, and we're all just dragging our speeds down. I hear businesses all the time that are on Gilman that they're down 80% of the day because we don't have what we need with bandwidth. So bandwidth needs to be key. And if that's in the facilities bucket, great. If it's not, let's get it into a priority bucket, even if it's transportation. I don't know. And then parks, I rate third only because of the high satisfaction rate we have in our parks. I think if we're looking at 2 years and what we can do first, second, and third, I'm going to put parks as that third bucket because I think we have a little bit more. We've devoted a lot of time and care to that. I'm not saying, again, it's unimportant. I'm just saying that I kind of agree with Jason's prioritization in the grand scheme of things and why I think that way. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Before, I was just going to say, it's 7:51, and this has been an amazing discussion, but I guess I'll just encourage us, since we have made a decision that we want to commit to ending on time, that we think about, kind of what some of our kind of closing comments are. Just anyway, Councilmember Hott, Zach.
Thank you. All right, so I have some thoughts about how we determine what buckets come first, second, and third, but I first want to touch on the second question, utilities, because I do agree that we can take utility improvements out of the equation, but I want to make sure we all understand why it's an option here in the first place and why it's worthy of discussion if we want to. So the city assesses utility needs, utility infrastructure, and depending on how much all that costs, we design a rate structure to pay for that. And so, like Jason said earlier, it's paid for itself with rates, which is true. But one thing we could consider as a group, if we wanted to, is to find another source of revenue to support utilities, which would then give us the opportunity to redesign the rate structure. Maybe we lower the rates because this group decides that it's a priority that we keep rates low, or we keep rates from not being volatile. So I just want to make sure that's on everyone's minds in case that hasn't been thought about. But this is a really smart group of people, so I'm sure you have. So with buckets, I'm thinking the buckets that we should prioritize are threefold in my brain. Buckets that have the most mix of projects in line with community survey priorities, strategic plan priorities, or community visibility priorities. So buckets with projects that with a mix of projects that we know have lots of community support. Buckets that have the fewest mix of projects qualifying for existing state or federal grant dollars, I think, should also be prioritized in our thinking. And then also buckets that have the most mix of projects with strategic timing or time-sensitive opportunities are worth prioritization as well. So when I'm thinking about prioritization of buckets, those are kind of the three main things I'm thinking. And yeah, Andrea.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the second one, please?
Oh yeah, it was if a bucket has buckets with the fewest mix of projects that qualify for state and federal grant opportunities. So it's a bucket that doesn't really have access to a lot of outside funding. I think that should be prioritized. Yeah.
I think I was next. I keep scribbling down notes about, they're kind of circling the same theme, and it like invest wisely, avoid stranded investments, and sort of thematically, at least to some extent, solving core or systemic problems, especially related to equity. And I'm going to leave it at that. And Stacy said never mind.
Cynthia, I know we only have 5 minutes, but I'd like to dig a little deeper, if I could, on what's a wise investment. What would what would you characterize as a wise investment?
Well, I didn't mean those as different. I was just scribbling some different things, and I guess one thing that would make a wise investment is something that you're avoiding stranded investments. So if you have a corridor like on Newport, for example, and you put roundabouts, and you have a, you want to get the whole way, like you don't want to have a stranded investment, or don't put in a retaining wall, that or don't permit it, or however that ever, don't put in a retaining wall that's going to have a huge long-term maintenance cost. But the systemic problem I was thinking about kind of comes back to mobility. There's an equity problem with reducing auto congestion over making alternative modes more safe. So I said a couple of different things, but just wanted to kind of get those thoughts out and on the record. So how are we doing? This is amazing. This is so fun. Yes, it is. Oh, she's, I keep forgetting she's there. That's funny. Gosh, it's 7:56. The only thing left in the agenda is other business and announcements, and the only other business and announcement that I know about is just to announce our next meeting. But Andrea, I don't know if you want to have make any other comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Really appreciate everything that was said. I have heard a lot this evening, so thank you for that. I look forward to the opportunity to kind of go back and digest the things that we've heard and discuss those things with our chair, Cynthia, and Vice Chair Jamie, to try to make sure that we have an equally or even more productive conversation next time. So our next conversation is November 16th, and we're going to be keeping with the same topic of trying to really determine what are our considerations, where do our priorities lie across these buckets. And so looking forward to hopefully finishing up that conversation in our next meeting on November 16th. I'm sorry, not November 16th. I'm thinking way too far ahead. Thank you. Yes, November 2nd. Thank you.
A lot of scrunched faces on the screen there.
Sorry about that. I was already I talked earlier with others about our November 16th meeting, thinking ahead that far. But yes, next meeting is November 2nd. Thank you.
Well, with that, I think we should probably adjourn 2 minutes early. Excellent. Thanks, you guys. That was amazing. Have a great night.